Hey, it's Ben Wilmore from Digital Mastery and Masters Academy. In here, I'm going to show you a start to finish processing of an image using Lightroom Classic. Now, the same adjustments are available in Adobe Camera Raw, so I could have performed this there. But let's start by taking a look at why I captured the image the way I did, because it doesn't look like the end result that I really wanted to achieve, but there's a good reason I did what I did. Here's my original capture. Notice how bright the background is. I very much did that on purpose in order to be able to get a good capture of this subject. Why? Well, when it comes to a really dark subject, the problem is your camera is going to put noise in the image in the dark end of the capture. So if your subject is overly dark, it's going to be overly noisy. And when you try to brighten it up in Photoshop or Lightroom, you're going to see all the noise showing up. But if I capture this as bright as I possibly can without losing detail in the image, then I can always darken things up, and noise isn't added when you darken things. Noise instead is captured by your camera, and it's done only in the dark portions of your image for most images. So let's take a look at this image a little closer. What I did when capturing this image is, if you look at my histogram, over here in the upper right, I tried to expose to the right, is what some people call it, which is make your image as bright as you possibly can without getting a spike on the end of the histogram. Now that's hard to do in camera when you're shooting raw, and that's because the preview you see in the back of your camera is actually having processing applied to it, and it's being processed as a JPEG image. And with JPEG images, it's adding contrast, trying to make the image look better than the actual camera is capturing. And what you're getting if you're shooting in RAW is you're getting something that has more highlight and more shadow detail than what that preview is showing you, and also what any histogram or zebra stripes or blinkies, little flashing highlights, are showing you. So when I captured this image, I went brighter and brighter until on my camera it was indicating that a good portion of the background was being blown out to solid white, either with a spike on the far right of the histogram, or with a mirrorless camera it would be zebra stripes that can show up, or on a DSLR I just play it back and then I can look and see either a histogram if there's a spike on the right to indicate something's white, or it's flashing, which often indicates something's white. In this case, I had probably about 30% of the background showing up with zebra stripes indicating it was solid white. I went that far knowing that there's additional information in the raw file that I can hope I can recover here. Now, if you want to see the end result, here is the end result. It's quite a bit different, but if you look at the subject of the photograph, it's not all noisy. And let's see how we got there. The first thing I did is I came in here to Lightroom's Develop module, and well, the brightest part of the picture is the problem, so why not come over here to the highlights, which tries to isolate the bright areas of your image. I'll bring it down, and even if I bring it all the way down, it seems to be not all that effective. So then the next thing I would do is come up here to exposure. That controls the full brightness range of your image, and I'm going to bring it down to try to compensate for that bright area of the picture. And by the time I get down to right about this range, I think I'm liking the brightness of the background. Well, the problem with that is exposure darkens your entire picture. And we had a dark subject to begin with, and now it's got pushed even darker. So I'm going to come down here next to this area called shadows. And with shadows, I can brighten up only the dark portions of the image, which in our case would be that subject. And I can generally crank it all the way up in this particular case. Well, anytime you end up with lowering your highlights really far like I have and bringing your shadows up really high, you're really doing the equivalent to taking contrast and lowering it. Contrast tells you how big of a difference should there be between really bright and really dark areas. Well, I might come in here and bring my contrast down as well, and that's going to cause bright and dark areas to look even more similar. The only problem is whenever you do something like that, where you end up either doing your highlights and shadows to extremes like this or lowering contrast, in my case I've done both, your image is going to start looking dull. And so to make it snap, I come down here to clarity. In clarity is going to add contrast to the image, but not generically over the whole image. It's going to do it to the fine details. Anywhere where there's little chunks of detail, it's going to enhance it. So I'm going to bump up my clarity a bit, somewhere in that general range to make it pop. But then if I look up here at my histogram now, you'll see on the right side is where white would usually be on the far right. And do you see that gap on the end? That tells me that nothing in this picture is truly white. So I would like the brightest part of my image to be white. And the reason why I want that is if you look at the image, if you ever see anything shiny, where the light source is reflecting off of it, like right here, that little highlight, and this little highlight, and that one. If you don't have those areas, which are known as specular highlights, rendered as white, the image will look dull when this is shown next to another image that does have white highlights. So I'm going to take the white slider and I'm going to move it to the right. As I do, watch the histogram and look at the gap that's there, and you should see that gap starting to get smaller and smaller. And once I get to the point where it hits the side, I know some area of my picture is becoming solid white, and I'd simply like to see where it is. And if it's in these areas with these really bright little reflections of the light source on something shiny, in this case something wet, then that's fine. So to see exactly where this is happening, I'm going to hold down the Option key, which is Alt in Windows, and then I'm going to go back to that white slider. And with my Option key held down, I'll click and hold on the whites, and now it's showing me where exactly things are becoming white. If you're seeing colors, those areas still have detail, but it's losing a little hint because behind the scenes, your image is made out of 3 pieces: red, green, and blue. And where you end up seeing black on the screen there, you have detail in all 3 of those pieces. When you see color, it means you've lost detail in 1 or 2 of those 3 pieces, but there's still some left because one of those 3 at least has the detail. When it goes to white in that display, you've lost detail in all 3, and you either have solid white in this case, or if you're working with the black slider, you'd be having solid black, no detail. So in this case, I Option click on the white slider. I'm ignoring areas that are in color. I'm looking at only areas that are white. And when I let go, I ask myself, is it on a shiny area? And that could be something metal, it could be mica, it could be something else. And also if it's a big area, like if you look at the bottom of the picture now, there's a large area. To me, that's too much. So I'll back off on that a bit. But in the end, we can end up using masking. And if I use masking, I could lower this setting for everything other than my subject. And if so, I wouldn't have to care about that big area at the bottom. So I'm going to look at just my subject and bring this up and say, is it primarily on shiny areas? And I would say at this point it is. And I'll just remember that I got larger areas of white on the background, and I'll fix that later when we start working on isolated areas. So now we got our whites. Then let's start working on the dark part of the image. So over here on the histogram, the left side is where black would be, the far left. And if there's a gap on the end, it means there is no black in your image. If you leave an image with no black, it's going to feel as if it looks kind of hazy. This is especially true if this image is going to be displayed next to any other picture that does have solid black. When you compare one that doesn't have black to one that does, the one with black will feel like it has punch, contrast, and the other one will look more like it was taken on a foggy day or something where it just doesn't quite look good. So I almost always, on the vast majority of my images, I'd say 90% of them, I make sure I have a small area of solid black. But I don't do that if it's something that's supposed to look hazy. It's fog, that kind of thing. So there are a couple different ways of getting the darkest area to black. One would be to use the black slider and move it to the left. As I move it to the left, you're going to find that gap starts going away. But sometimes I use a little trick, and that is to come down here to a slider that's called dehaze. Dehaze usually ends up giving me a little bit more shadow detail as I do it. And so I'm going to bring up dehaze just a little bit, and then I'll adjust my blacks. Now with blacks, I want to see when an area becomes black, and I can do that similarly to how we adjusted whites, in that I'll hold down the Option key, Alt and Windows. I click and hold on it, and right now you can see there's one little speck, I think, near the middle of my screen that might be dark, but otherwise I bring it down until I see not just a speck, but a small blob. So you know it's not a speck of noise. And right about here, I start to see a little bit of a blob where it's maybe 5 or 6 pixels clustered together. And that's about as far as I would usually want to go when it comes to adjusting my blacks. Now at this point, I'm going to start thinking about the color. And so I'm going to work with my temperature setting, because I might want to make this image a little warmer or a little cooler. And so I'm just going to move this really far in one direction and then really far in the opposite direction. And then I'll kind of swing between those two, and I'll try to ignore the slider and just look at the image. And it's only if I've swung it to the extremes and then I don't look at the slider itself that I'm able to forget what the original looked like and truly concentrate on what looks best. And to me, right around that point is where I happen to have liked it. Then I'll come down here and I'm going to adjust vibrance. Yeah, that's going to make the image more colorful. And so I'll crank that up a bit, and just don't want to make things too colorful where they look unrealistic. Then at this point, I would usually have cropped the image. I didn't tell you ahead of time, but this image has already been cropped. If I go to my crop tool, you can see that it's been rotated a teeny bit and cropped. And that was just personal taste to do it. If I come in here and reset my crop, you can see what the original looked like. And that's because this guy was moving around and I wanted to make sure I didn't cut him off or anything. So I shot him near the middle, but to me, that's not the best compositionally. So I used the crop tool and ended up with this cropping. After cropping the image, then I wanted to get your attention away from the edges of the image. So I came down to this section down here called Effects. And that's where I find post-crop vignetting. With that, I'd like to change this setting to color overlay, because I find it usually gives me a better looking end result in most instances. And then the sliders below are grayed out unless I change my amount. And so I'm just going to bring my amount down a little bit. Bringing it down darkens, bringing it up would brighten. And then I'm going to adjust these sliders. The vast majority of the time, I take my feathering setting and crank it up. Feathering is how soft of a transition you want. And I want a really soft transition, so it's hard to see where I've done this. Then when I adjust these other sliders, I'm going to hold down the Option key, that's Alt and Windows. And if I have that key held down when I'm moving these sliders, it's going to act as if the amount slider was turned all the way down. So it's going to show me the maximum darkness it would apply. And so I'll come in here and choose midpoint, and I'm going to bring it in, but I don't want this to be covering the subject matter that's there. So I'll limit myself. Then I'll choose roundness, and I'll swing it one direction and then swing it the other and decide which one is best for this particular subject matter. And to me, somewhere right around in there. And then I'll readjust my midpoint to make sure that it's not covering the subject very much. And then finally, with no keys held down, I'll come up here to the amount slider and I'll bring it down until it's way too much. Because if I don't do that and I instead start in the middle where it defaults and then bring it down slowly, oftentimes I don't bring it far enough. I think, oh, I've just noticed what it looked like without it and it's noticeable to me. But if I crank it, then I can get used to this a little bit and then back off until it no longer feels to be overdone. And usually I end up with a little more aggressiveness with that. You can get away with quite a bit of vignetting when you have a lot of detail in your background like this. You can't when you have something like a blue sky. It becomes too obvious. So now at this point, I'm going to start working on isolated areas. I think I have the image as a whole not looking too bad, but I'd like my subject to pop a bit more, and I want to deal with those areas that I've been forced to solid white. So let's go up here to the new masking features that are in Lightroom, and I'm going to tell this to select the subject of the photograph by clicking right there, and I'll just cross my fingers and hope it gets my subject. Now you can see it got a lot more than the subject because it added the shadow as well, and just some of the general background. So the next thing I'm going to do is over here, I'm going to choose subtract, and I'm going to tell it I want to subtract using a brush. Then with that brush, I'm going to start by coming in and just dialing in my settings. I'm going to have my density at 100 and my flow at 100. And that means wherever I paint, I get the full force of what I'm doing. And then I'm going to adjust my size and my feathering. To do so, I usually use 2 fingers on the trackpad that I'm working with, like the trackpad that's on a laptop, or you can use a scroll wheel and a mouse, and that changes the size. And if you add shift, I'll just hold shift and slide, I can control the feathering. And so I'm going to go for a brush that is maybe about that big with about that amount of feather. Then I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to start painting where the shadow was here that I did not want. And I'm going to try to get rid of some of that. And if I'm going to leave this edge not being perfect, if anything, I'm going to err on the side of taking away too much, because I would rather have a dark edge on my subject than a glowy edge going into my background. And so I will get in there. In some of these areas, I'm going to be able to cheat, like right in here. I'm going to turn on a setting called Auto Mask. You can just type the letter A to toggle Auto Mask, and it looks at the very center of your brush. And when you click, it tries to only paint on things that are that brightness and color. So when I click there, I should be able to get in there and get a more precise edge, and it's not going to remove from a very dark subject. So I might look around here for any areas where Auto Mask would be useful, like right here and right in here. And it's not going to be useful where we have an extremely dark shadow, because it'll just say, try to remove dark stuff, and my subject is dark. So it's going to also do that. So I'm just looking for areas where that background is bright enough and a big enough difference from the subject where it might be useful to use Auto Mask. Then another thing that I'm going to do is just type A to turn off Auto Mask, and I'll get a smaller brush. You should be aware though, is as your brush gets larger and smaller, that feathering zone, that fade out zone, which is the distance between the 2 circles, also gets reduced. So if I end up getting a tiny brush, then most of the time I'm going to need to come over here and increase my feathering, because with a smaller brush, it just scales down the feathering as well. I don't need to get everything perfect because nobody's ever going to see this mask, and I just need to be able to look around the image afterwards and decide if it looks good or not. And photographers traditionally in the darkroom used very blurry masks when they brightened and darkened images, and you can get away with a much softer brush and a much more basic masking than a lot of people are aware of. But I'll just clean this up a little bit. And the reason why I'm isolating the general shadow from this image is because otherwise, if I put out too much detail in the shadows and brighten it up too much, it's just going to look artificial. But I think I'm starting to get to the point where I think I'll be okay with my isolation, if I can speak. All right, then I'm going to move the sliders that are over here. And when I move the slider, that colored overlay will likely go away. If your settings are set up where it doesn't do that, you would manually turn it off with this checkbox. But now let's adjust our image. I'm going to lower contrast. Contrast is how big of a difference is there between bright and dark. And that should, on a dark subject, make it so I can see a little bit more of what's in there. Or if I want to work only on the really dark stuff, I could come down here to shadows and I could increase it to bring out some of that shadow detail in our subject. But then I want the subject to pop. And to do so, I'm going to bring up clarity. And clarity is going to make the finer details pop out a bit. I just don't want to overdo it. If you overdo it, it's going to darken too much on dark subjects. Then I'd usually zoom up and I would think about adjusting texture. In this case, I just remember that I'd had texture up a little bit. Texture brings out the really, really fine details in the image. Another thing that I like to do commonly is to get my subject to separate from the background by making the color slightly different, by adjusting temperature or tint just a little bit. And in this case, I can make it more yellow or more bluish. And I think I'm going to make it a little bit more bluish just so it doesn't pick up as much of the yellow that you see in the background. And that often separates it. Well, now I'd like to work on the background. I'd like to make the bright areas not quite as bright and make it probably not quite as colorful. So how can I make an inverted version of this mask where we're working on the exact opposite area? Well, let's find out. I'm going to go to these little three dots and I'm going to say, let's duplicate this mask. When we duplicate it though, it's not going to reset our adjustment sliders. So those adjustment sliders are going to apply twice. So now we have two identical masks with the same adjustment. I don't want this adjustment. So I'm going to come up here to the word effect and I'm going to double click on it. And that will reset all the sliders that are found underneath that heading. And now therefore we don't have any adjustment applied. Anytime you don't have an adjustment applied, it will usually show you the overlay. And right now you can see it's the crab that we'd be working on. I want the exact opposite. So how can I do that? Well, you can't go to this mask and click on the three dots and choose invert. It'd be nice if you could. Instead, you need to come down below that to the elements that make up that mask and start with the bottom one. That's subject. I just clicked on it to make it active. Down here, I see the word select subject and there's a checkbox for inverting it. Well, I'm going to do that. That means select the opposite of the subject. But then here I have a brush. In that brush, I do not want to choose invert because what that brush is set up to do is take away from my mask. And if my mask is all the background, what I want to do is add these areas because these are the areas where we have the shadow and other things. So instead of clicking on the mask and choosing invert, which might be the natural thing you would think of doing, I want to instead click on that and go to the right where these three little dots are for the one called brush. And I'm going to say convert to add because then it's going to do the opposite of what it was doing before. You see the little minus sign that's here means it was taking away previously. When I convert to add, that will change. And now it no longer has a minus sign, which means it was adding. And now if you look at the mask as a whole here, or at just the green overlay, you can see we're working on the opposite areas. So now with those areas, I'm going to come down here and think about what kind of adjustment would I want. Well, I might bring my whites down because you remember how we had some areas in the image that were solid white in that background. So I'll bring that down a little bit. I might also do a few other adjustments. I find that there's a little too much color distracting me here in the background. So I'm going to bring my saturation down until I think more about the crab than the color in the background. So I think we should be good somewhere, maybe even go as far as that. Then I could come over here and add some density to this. If I want some more, I might bring up dehaze just a little bit. That should add a good amount of density. Maybe not quite that far. And then I'm going to come in here and adjust clarity. Clarity is going to control the kind of finer details in there. And if I brought it up, it would make more of them show up. Bring it down, it can soften. And in this case, I might bring it down just a little bit. Well, there we've adjusted our subject and our background, but now I want to control where your eye is going to be drawn. So I'm going to make another new mask by clicking on this plus sign. And this time I'm just going to use a brush. And when I use my brush, I'm going to turn auto mask off. And I'm just going to have a nice soft edge brush that's not all that big. And I'm going to paint where I want your eye to be drawn strongly. And that would be this general area right here. And then I'll just do a little bit to that. If you look at our histogram, do you see that gap that's on the right side of the histogram? Well, I want to generally eliminate that. I'm going to bring the whites up and see. I'm not going to look at the gap though, because nobody else is going to see that histogram. They're going to see my image. So I'm looking at the image and I'm saying, let's bring up the whites until I like how bright the brightest area is in there. If I double click on this slider, you'll see what it looked like before I did that. And then after. I'm also going to bring out a little bit of shadow detail in that area. so it's a little easier to see what's there. And I might try to bring up clarity a little to make the detail pop just a little bit. You got to be careful on dark subjects though, because that can get them to be a little too dark. And then one last thing, and that is there's this one green speck that's in here, and I want to get rid of it. So I'm going to switch from my masking tool over here to my spot removal tool. I'm going to make sure it's set to heal, and I'm going to make sure the feather setting is turned all the way down. By turning feather all the way down, it gives this tool control all the way out to the edge of the brush. Then I'll come over here and click, and if my brush isn't big enough for the whole object, I can drag across it to get rid of that area. And then one final thing when I look at this image as a whole is I'm drawn a little bit to the joints that are here. And if I don't want to be drawn to it quite as much, I could come down here to HSL and work on saturation and just say bring the greens down just a little bit. Not much, but just so my eye is not overly drawn to that area. And I could bring up aquas and blues because that's what's in the subject in this area. Then if you want to see how much each thing contributed to the image, we can come in here to each one of these sections, and I could turn off the effects to see what it looked like without the vignetting, and you see how your eye is not quite as drawn to the central portion of the image. I could come up here and do our HSL. I doubt it's a huge change to the image, but that's just making the greens a little bit less. And I could also come up here to my masking, and there's a little light switch for it only when you're in the masking. If I turn that off, there's what it looked like when I optimized the entire part of the image before I started working on isolated areas. And there's what it looked like after using my masking. So there you have it, from capture to final using only Lightroom. I'm Ben Wilmore, and I'll see you next time.